260 Ottawa couple. Their love story hid a secret that shocked historians. The unlikely meeting. The autumn of 260 painted Ottawa in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, as the young Dominion of Canada's capital city bustled with the energy of a nation finding its identity. Gas lamps flickered to life along the cobblestone streets as evening descended, casting long shadows between the limestone buildings that housed the government offices, merchant shops, and the homes of Ottawa's growing elite. Margaret Elizabeth Thornton stepped carefully down the wooden steps of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, her burgundy silk dress rustling softly in the crisp October air. At 23, she was considered by many to be one of Ottawa's most eligible young ladies, the daughter of Judge William Thornton, a respected member of the colonial judiciary, who had helped shape the legal framework of the new confederation. Her auburn hair was perfectly arranged beneath a fashionable hat, adorned with ostrich feathers, and her green eyes sparkled with the intelligence that had made her a favorite in Ottawa social circles. Margaret had just finished her weekly volunteer work at the church's charity kitchen, where she helped serve meals to the city's less fortunate residents. It was work that her father barely tolerated, considering it beneath the station of a judge's daughter, but Margaret found purpose in these small acts of service that connected her to the real struggles of ordinary people. As she made her way toward her waiting carriage, Margaret noticed a commotion near the church's side entrance. A small crowd had gathered around a man who appeared to be in some distress. Her natural compassion overrode her social conditioning, and she approached to see if she could help. The man at the center of attention was unlike anyone Margaret had ever encountered in Ottawa's refined social circles. He was tall and lean, with sun-withered skin that spoke of a life spent outdoors. His dark hair was longer than fashionable, and his clothes, while clean, were clearly the practical garments of a working man, rather than the fine fabrics worn by Ottawa's gentlemen. Most striking of all were his eyes, deep brown and intense, with a quality that seemed to see beyond surface appearances. "Please," the man was saying to the small crowd, his voice carrying a slight accent that Margaret couldn't immediately place. "I am looking for Dr. Harris. He was told he sometimes comes here in the evenings." The church's deacon, Mr. Whitmore, looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, but Dr. Harrison isn't here this evening. Perhaps you could visit his office tomorrow during proper hours." Margaret could see the frustration and worry in the stranger's face. Something about his demeanor, the way he held himself with quiet dignity despite his obvious distress, moved her to action. "Excuse me," she said, stepping forward. The crowd turned to look at her, and she could see surprise in their faces that someone of her social standing would involve herself in such a situation. "I couldn't help but overhear. Is there some way I might assist you?" The man looked at her with surprise, his intense gaze taking in her fine clothes and obvious social position. For a moment, Margaret thought he might refuse her help, pride preventing him from accepting assistance from someone so clearly above his station. "My daughter," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "She is very ill. I was told Dr. Harrison is a good man, that he sometimes helps people who cannot pay full price for medical care." Margaret's heart went out to him immediately. "What is wrong with your daughter?" "Fever," he replied. "It has been 3 days now. She cannot keep food down, and she burns like fire." His voice broke slightly. "I am afraid I might lose her." Without hesitation, Margaret turned to her driver. "Thomas, please take us to Dr. Harrison's residence immediately." The crowd murmured in surprise. It was highly unusual for a young lady of Margaret's position to involve herself so directly in the affairs of a stranger, particularly one who was clearly not of her social class. "Miss Thornton," Miss Whitmore said with concern, "perhaps it would be more appropriate to simply provide the gentleman with Dr. Harrison's address." But Margaret was already moving toward her carriage. "Time may be crucial when a child's life is at stake," she said firmly. "Sir," she addressed the stranger, "please come with me." The man hesitated for a moment, clearly overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness from someone he had never met. I cannot impose upon you, miss. You don't even know my name. Then tell me your name, Margaret said with a gentle smile. Joseph, he replied. Joseph Crow-Feather. The surname caused a ripple of recognition through the small crowd. Crow-Feather was clearly a native name, which explained the man's distinctive features and the slight accent Margaret had noticed. In Huichos Nascente, Ottawa, interactions between the white population and indigenous peoples were limited and often fraught with tension and misunderstanding. Margaret, however, seemed unaffected by this revelation. Mr. Crow-Feather, I am Margaret Thornton. Now please, let us go see about your daughter. As they rode through the gaslit streets of Ottawa toward Harrison's residence, Margaret learned more about the man sitting across from her in the carriage. Joseph Crow-Feather was Algonquin, from a small community outside the city. He worked as a guide and translator for government officials who needed to communicate with various indigenous communities in the region. His wife had died 2 years earlier, leaving him to raise their 8-year-old daughter, Sarah, alone. She is everything to me, Joseph said quietly, as they traveled. When her mother died, I promised I would protect her, keep her safe. If I lose her too, Margaret could hear the depth of his love and fear in his voice. We won't let that happen, she said with a conviction that surprised even herself. Dr. Harrison, a kindly man in his 60s, who had served Ottawa's community for over 30 years, answered his door with some surprise at the late hour. When he saw Margaret, his expression became one of concern. Miss Thornton, is everything all right? Is your father well? Dr. Harrison, this is Mr. Crow-Feather. His daughter is gravely ill, and I was hoping you might be able to help. Dr. Harrison looked from Margaret to Joseph, taking in the situation quickly. He had known Margaret since he was a child, and was familiar with her compassionate nature, but even he was surprised by her direct involvement in this situation. Of course, he said without hesitation, let me get my bag. If you're enjoying this fascinating historical love story and want to see more content like this, please take a moment to like this video. Your support helps us continue bringing these incredible untold stories to light. The journey to Joseph's home took them beyond the refined streets of central Ottawa, through areas where the city gradually gave way to the wilderness that still dominated much of the Ottawa Valley. Margaret had never ventured into these parts before, and she found herself fascinated by this different world that existed just beyond the boundaries of her familiar social sphere. Joseph's home was a modest log cabin situated near the Ottawa River, surrounded by tall pines and maples that rustled softly in the evening breeze. It was simple but well-maintained, with a small garden that showed evidence of careful tending and a woodpile that spoke of preparation for the coming winter. Inside, the cabin was warm and clean, furnished with a mixture of European-style furniture and indigenous crafts that reflected Joseph's position between two worlds. But Margaret's attention was immediately drawn to the small figure lying on a bed near the fireplace. Sarah Crow-Feather was a beautiful child with her father's dark eyes and her mother's delicate features. Her face was flushed with fever, and she tossed restlessly in her sleep, occasionally murmuring words in what Margaret assumed was Algonquin. Harrison immediately went to work, examining the child with the gentle efficiency of long experience. Margaret found herself naturally assisting, holding Sarah's hand while the doctor took her temperature and listened to her breathing. It's pneumonia, Harrison announced after his examination. But we've caught it early enough. With proper care and medication, she should recover fully. The relief on Joseph's face was profound. Thank you, he said to the doctor, then turned to Margaret. And thank you, Miss Thornton. I don't know how to repay such kindness. There's no need for repayment, Margaret replied. I'm just glad we could help. Dr. Harrison prepared medications and gave detailed instructions for Sarah's care. She'll need constant attention for the next few days, he explained. Someone should be with her at all times to monitor her fever and ensure she takes her medicine. Joseph nodded solemnly. I will not leave her side. Mr. Crow-Feather, Margaret said thoughtfully. You mentioned that you work as a guide and translator. Won't your employers expect you to be available? Joseph's expression grew troubled. Yes, but Sarah is more important than any job. I will find a way to manage. Margaret made a decision that would surprise everyone, including herself. What if I stayed to help? I have some experience with nursing. I helped care for my grandmother during her final illness. I could watch over Sarah during the day while you attend to your work obligations. The suggestion caused both men to stare at her in astonishment. The idea of a young lady of Margaret's social standing, staying in the home of an indigenous man, even for charitable purposes, was unprecedented and potentially scandalous. Miss Thornton, Harrison said carefully, while your intentions are admirably, I'm not sure such an arrangement would be appropriate. What's not appropriate, Margaret replied with quiet determination, is allowing a child to suffer when I have the ability to help. Crow Feather, would you accept my assistance? Joseph looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Miss Thornton, you don't understand what you're offering. If people in your society knew you were staying here, helping my family, it could cause problems for you. Let me worry about that, Margaret said firmly. The question is whether you'll accept my help. After another moment of consideration, Joseph nodded slowly. I would be honored by your assistance, but I insist that you allow me to arrange for proper accommodations. My neighbor, Miss Whitey Dove, is a widow with a comfortable home. You could stay with her and come here during the day. And so began an arrangement that would change both their lives forever. For the next week, Margaret spent her days at Joseph's cabin, caring for Sarah, and gradually learning about a world she had never imagined. She discovered that Joseph was not just a guide and translator, but also a skilled craftsman who created beautiful wood carvings and an educated man who spoke 4 languages fluently. More importantly, she began to see beyond the cultural barriers that had always seemed so insurmountable. Joseph was intelligent, thoughtful, and deeply devoted to his daughter. He treated Margaret with a respect and consideration that was notably different from the patronizing attitude she often encountered from men in her own social circle. As Sarah's health improved, the little girl became fascinated by Margaret. She was curious about Margaret's clothes, her hair, and her way of speaking. In return, Sarah began teaching Margaret words in Algonquin and sharing stories her mother had told her about their people's traditions. My mother used to say that the Creator brings people together for a reason, Sarah said one afternoon as she sat up in bed, finally well enough to eat solid food. Maybe he brought you to help us. Margaret found herself deeply moved by the child's simple faith and wisdom. Maybe he did. She agreed. During the long hours of Sarah's recovery, Margaret and Joseph had many opportunities to talk. She learned about his childhood, growing up in a world where traditional ways were being rapidly displaced by European settlement. He had been educated at a mission school, which explained his fluency in English and French, but had chosen to maintain his connection to his indigenous heritage. It's difficult, he explained one evening, as they sat by Sarah's bedside. The government officials I work with expect me to be a bridge between our peoples, but sometimes I feel like I belong fully to neither world. Margaret found herself sharing her own struggles with the constraints of her social position. Sometimes I feel trapped by expectations, she admitted. Everyone assumes that because I'm a judge's daughter, I should be content with social gatherings and finding a suitable husband, but I want to do something meaningful with my life. What would you do if you could choose freely? Joseph asked. Margaret considered the question seriously. I think I would like to teach, or perhaps work with Dr. Harrison to help people who can't afford medical care. I want to make a difference in people's lives. Those are noble goals, Joseph said. In my culture, we believe that everyone has a gift to share with the community. Perhaps your gift is compassion. These conversations revealed a meeting of minds that transcended their different backgrounds. Both were thoughtful, principled people who felt constrained by the expectations of their respective societies. Both valued education, service to others, and the importance of family. As the week progressed, Margaret became aware that her feelings toward Joseph were evolving beyond simple admiration and friendship. She found herself looking forward to their conversations, noticing the way his eyes lit up when he smiled, and feeling a warmth in his presence that she had never experienced with any of the young men from her own social circle. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. She was falling in love with a man whose very existence challenged everything her society believed about appropriate relationships and social boundaries. Chapter 3: Forbidden Feelings. By the end of Sarah's second week of recovery, it was clear that the little girl was well on her way to full health. Her fever had broken completely, her appetite had returned, and she was beginning to show the energy and curiosity natural to an 8-year-old. Harrison pronounced her out of danger, though he recommended continued rest for a few more days. Margaret knew that her time at the Crow Feather home was coming to an end, and the thought filled her with an unexpected sadness. Over the past 2 weeks, she had discovered a sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing from her privileged but constrained life in Ottawa society. More troubling was her growing awareness of her feelings for Joseph. What had begun as compassionate concern for a father in distress had evolved into something much deeper and more complex. She found herself studying his face when he wasn't looking, treasuring their conversations and feeling a flutter of excitement whenever their hands accidentally touched while caring for Sarah. Joseph, for his part, seemed to be experiencing similar feelings. Margaret had noticed the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't aware, the careful consideration he gave to her opinions, and the gentle way he had begun to include her in family decisions about Sarah's care. The situation came to a head on a crisp November afternoon, when Sarah was well enough to sit outside in the autumn sunshine. Margaret was helping the little girl with a reading lesson when Joseph returned early from his work in the city. "Papa," Sarah called out happily, "Miss Margaret has been teaching me to read English words." Joseph smiled as he approached them, but Margaret could see tension in his expression. "That's wonderful, little one. Miss Margaret is a very good teacher. Is everything all right?" Margaret asked, noting his subdued mood. Joseph glanced at Sarah, who was absorbed in her book, then looked at Margaret with an expression that made her heart race. "Could I speak with you privately for a moment?" They walked a short distance from the cabin, stopping near the edge of the river, where the sound of flowing water would mask their conversation from Sarah's curious ears. "Margaret," Joseph began, then stopped and corrected himself. "Miss Thornton, I need to tell you something." "Please," Margaret said softly. "Call me Margaret. After everything we've shared these past weeks, I think we're beyond such formalities." Joseph looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting a struggle between desire and duty. "Margaret, then, I've been thinking about your situation, about the time you've spent here with us." Margaret felt her heart begin to pound. "What about it? People in the city are beginning to talk," Joseph said carefully. "I heard whispers today when I was working with the government official. They're saying that George Thornton's daughter has been spending time in the Indian settlement, that you've been seen coming and going from my home." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "What exactly are they saying?" "Nothing specific yet, but the implications are clear. Your reputation could be damaged by association with me, with my family. I can't allow that to happen." "You can't allow it?" Margaret's voice carried a note of challenge. "Don't I have a say in what risks I'm willing to take to save?" Stepped closer, and Margaret could see the conflict in his expression. "Margaret, you don't understand what you're risking. In your world, a woman's reputation is everything. If people believe that you've been inappropriately involved with an Indian, you could be ostracized from society. Your father's position could be affected. Your future marriage prospects would be destroyed. And what if I don't care about those things?" Margaret asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both understood but neither had yet dared to voice. "You should care," Joseph said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You have a life, a future in Ottawa society. You shouldn't throw that away for what? Margaret pressed. For friendship? For helping sick child? Or for something more? Joseph looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Margaret, please don't make this more difficult than it already is. I'm not making anything difficult, Margaret replied, stepping closer to him. I'm simply asking you to be honest about what's happening between us. When Joseph finally looked at her again, Margaret could see the truth in his eyes. The same feelings that had been growing in her own heart were reflected there. You know what's happening, he said quietly, but knowing it and acting on it are two different things. Even if we both feel what we feel, there's no future in it. Our words are too different. Are they? Margaret challenged. These past 2 weeks, I felt more at home here, with you and Sarah, than I've ever felt in my father's house. I felt more useful, more valued, more myself than I ever have in Ottawa society. Joseph reached out as if to touch her face, then stopped himself, his hand falling to his side. Marguerite, what you're suggesting is impossible. Even if we could overcome the social barriers, even if we could find a way to be together, what kind of life could I offer you? I live in a log cabin. I work as a guide and translator. I have no wealth, no social position. You don't care about wealth or social position, Margaret said fiercely. I care about kindness, intelligence, integrity. I care about the way you love your daughter, the way you treat people with respect regardless of their station. I care about the way you make me feel like I matter, like my thoughts and opinions have value. Margaret, Joseph's voice was pained. I love you, Margaret said simply, the words escaping before she could stop them. I know it's impossible. I know it's impractical. But I love you. A confession hung between them, like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Joseph stared at her, his expression a mixture of joy, pain, and fear. I love you too, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. God help me, I love you too. They stood there for a moment, the weight of their mutual confession settling around them. Then, as if drawn by forces beyond their control, they moved toward each other. Joseph's hands came up to cup Margaret's face, his thumbs gently tracing her cheekbones. This is madness, he murmured. Then let's be mad, Margaret whispered back. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, as if they were both afraid that too much passion might shatter the fragile moment. But as their lips met, Margaret felt a sense of rightness, of coming home, that she had never experienced before. When they finally separated, both were breathing heavily, the magnitude of what they had just acknowledged settling over them. What do we do now? Margaret asked. Joseph looked toward the cabin where Sarah was still reading, then back at Margaret. I don't know, he admitted. I honestly don't know. This love story is taking an incredible turn. If you're captivated by Margaret and Joseph's forbidden romance, please leave a comment below telling us what you think will happen next. We love hearing your thoughts and predictions. The weeks that followed Margaret and Joseph's confession were filled with a bittersweet mixture of joy and anxiety. They had crossed a line from which there could be no return, yet they were acutely aware that their love existed in a space between worlds where discovery could mean disaster for both of them. Margaret returned to her father's house and resumed her normal social obligations, but everything felt different now. The dinner parties, charity events, and social goals that had once provided structure to her life now seemed hollow and meaningless. She found herself going through the motions of her expected role, while her heart and mind remained with Joseph and Sarah. Jacques Thornton noticed his daughter's distraction, but attributed it to what he assumed was a natural restlessness in a young woman of marriageable age. He began making more pointed suggestions about suitable young men in Ottawa society, unaware that his daughter's heart had already been claimed by someone he would consider entirely unsuitable. Margaret, my dear, he said one evening, over dinner, young Thomas Whitmore has asked permission to call on you. He's a fine young man with excellent prospects in the law. I think you should consider receiving him. Margaret looked up from her barely touched meal. Father, I'm not ready to consider marriage to anyone at the moment. Nonsense, Judge Thorne replied. You're 23 years old. It's time you settled down and started a family. Thomas comes from a good family, and his father's law practice is quite successful. I'm sure Mr. Whitmore is a fine gentleman, Margaret said carefully, but I simply don't feel ready for such a commitment. Her father studied her with the keen eye that had served him well on the bench. Margaret, you've seemed distracted lately. Is there something troubling you? Margaret felt her heart race, but she managed to keep her voice steady. I've simply been thinking about my future, father, about what I want to do with my life. What you want to do with your life is marry well and raise children, Judge Thornton said firmly. That is the natural order of things for a woman of your station. Margaret bit back the response that sprang to her lips. Instead, she excused herself from dinner and retreated to her room, where she spent the evening writing in her journal, a practice that had become her only outlet for the emotions she couldn't share with anyone else. Meanwhile, Joseph was struggling with his own challenges. His work as a government translator had become more demanding as tensions between indigenous communities and the federal government increased. The Indian Act of 1876 was creating new restrictions and requirements that affected every aspect of indigenous life, and Joseph found himself in the difficult position of having to explain and sometimes defend policies he personally disagreed with. More troubling were the subtle changes in how some of his government colleagues treated him. The whispers about his association with Judge Thornton's daughter had reached official circles, and while no one made direct accusations, Joseph could sense a new coolness in their interactions. "Crow feather," said Mr. Patterson, the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs, after a particularly tense meeting with representatives from several indigenous communities. "I trust you understand the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries in your interactions with government officials and their families." The warning was subtle, but Joseph's position depended on his ability to navigate between worlds without causing scandal or embarrassment to the government officials who employed him. Despite these pressures, Margaret and Joseph found ways to see each other. Margaret would volunteer for charity work that took her to different parts of the city, creating opportunities to meet Joseph at predetermined locations. They would walk along the Ottawa River, talking about everything and nothing, treasuring these stolen moments together. Sarah, who had grown quite fond of Margaret during her illness, became an unwitting accomplice in their courtship. Margaret would visit under the guise of continuing the little girl's English lessons, and these visits provided cover for the growing relationship between Margaret and Joseph. "Miss Margaret," Sarah said one afternoon as they worked on reading together, "are you going to marry my papa?" The innocent question caught Margaret completely off guard. "Sarah, what makes you ask such a thing?" "Papa smiles different when you're here," Sarah explained with the straightforward logic of childhood. "And you look at him the way Mama used to look at him before she got sick." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "Sarah, your papa and I, it's complicated." "Why?" Sarah asked. "Don't you love each other?" The simple question cut straight to the heart of their dilemma. "Sometimes, little one, love isn't enough. Sometimes there are other things that make it difficult for people to be together." Sarah considered this with the seriousness of a child, trying to understand adult complexities. "But if you love each other, and if you're both good people, why can't you be together?" Margaret struggled to find an answer that would make sense to an 8-year-old without destroying her innocent faith in the power of love. Because sometimes the world has rules that don't make sense, but that people follow anyway. "That's stupid," Sarah declared with characteristic childhood bluntness. Margaret couldn't help but smile. "Yes, sweetheart, sometimes it is." As winter deepened, Margaret and Joseph's relationship continued to develop in secret. They shared books, with Joseph introducing Margaret to indigenous stories and oral traditions while Margaret shared her favorite poetry and literature. They discussed philosophy, politics, and their dreams for the future. They talked about their childhoods, their fears, and their hopes. Most importantly, they talked about the seemingly impossible question of their future together. Both were intelligent enough to understand the obstacles they faced, but both were also too much in love to simply walk away from what they had found. "Sometimes I think we should run away," Margaret said one snowy December afternoon as they walked along the frozen river. "Just take Sarah and go somewhere where no one knows us, where we could start fresh." Joseph squeezed her gloved hand. "And go away. There's nowhere in this country where an Indian man and a white woman could live together without facing prejudice and suspicion." "Then we'll go somewhere else," Margaret said with the determination that Joseph had come to love about her. "America, perhaps, or even Europe." "Margaret, be practical," Joseph said gently. "I have no money for such a journey, and even if I did, what would we do when we got there? How would we live?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, then said, "I have some money of my own. My grandmother left me a small inheritance that my father has been managing. When I turn 25, it becomes mine to control." Joseph stopped walking and turned to face her. "Margaret, I could never take your money. What kind of man would I be if I lived off my wife's inheritance?" The word wife hung in the air between them. The first time either had spoken so directly about marriage, the kind of man who loves his wife enough to build a new life with her. Margaret replied, "Joseph, I don't care about money or social position. I care about being with you and Sarah. I care about building a life based on love and mutual respect." Joseph pulled her into his arms, holding her close despite the risk of being seen. "I want that too," he whispered against her hair. "More than anything, I want that too." But even as they held each other, both knew that wanting something and achieving it were two very different things. The obstacles they faced were not just social, but legal. In the age of 170, Canada, marriages between indigenous people and non-indigenous people faced significant legal and bureaucratic hurdles, and the social consequences could be devastating for both parties. As they walked back toward the city, neither spoke of the growing sense that their secret courtship was approaching a crisis point. Something would have to give soon. Either they would find a way to be together openly, or the pressures of their situation would force them apart. What neither of them knew was that their secret was about to be discovered in a way that would change everything. Chapter 5. Discovery and Consequences. The revelation came on a bitter February morning when Ottawa was blanketed in fresh snow and the Ottawa River was frozen solid. Margaret had arranged to meet Joseph at their usual spot along the river path, using the excuse of visiting the city's new public library to research a charity project. She arrived early, as was her habit, and was standing near a grove of snow-laden pine trees when she heard familiar voices approaching. Her heart sank as she recognized her father's distinctive baritone, accompanied by the voice of Thomas Whitmore, the lawyer who had been pressing for his son's courtship of Margaret. "The library project is an excellent initiative," Judge Thornton was saying as the two men walked along the path. "Margaret has been quite involved in the planning. She has a good mind for such things." "Young Thomas is quite impressed with Miss Margaret's intelligence," Mr. Whitmore replied. "He finds her conversation most stimulating. Not like some of these empty-headed young ladies who can only discuss fashion and gossip." Margaret pressed herself against a large pine tree, hoping to remain hidden until the men passed. But fate had other plans. At that moment, Joseph appeared on the path from the opposite direction, clearly heading toward their meeting spot. He saw Margaret's father and Mr. Whitmore immediately and tried to turn back, but it was too late. Judge Thornton had noticed him. "You there," the judge called out. "Aren't you the translator who works with the Indian Affairs Office?" Joseph had no choice but to approach. "Yes, sir," Joseph Crowfeather. "Of course, Judge," Thornton said, studying Joseph with the analytical gaze he used in court. "I remember you from the Henderson land dispute case. You provided translation services." "Yes, sir," Joseph replied, his voice carefully neutral. Marguerite remained hidden, her heart pounding, as she watched this unexpected encounter between the two most important men in her life. "What brings you to this part of the city?" Mr. Whitmore asked, his tone carrying a subtle note of suspicion. Joseph hesitated for just a moment, a hesitation that Judge Thornton's trained eye caught immediately. "I had business at the government offices, sir. I was taking a walk before returning home." It was a reasonable explanation, but something about the situation didn't sit right with Judge Thornton. His judicial instincts, honed by years of detecting deception in courtrooms, were telling him that there was more to this encounter than met the eye. "I see," the judge said slowly. "Well, good day to you, Mr. Crowfeather." "Good day, sir," Joseph replied, and continued walking in the direction he had been heading, away from where Margaret was hidden. After the men had passed, Margaret waited several more minutes before emerging from her hiding place. She was shaking, not from the cold, but from the close call they had just experienced. She made her way home without meeting Joseph, knowing that it would be too dangerous to continue with their planned rendezvous. That evening, Judge Thornton was unusually quiet during dinner. Margaret could sense something was troubling him, but she didn't dare ask what it might be. After the meal, he retired to his study, where he spent the evening in deep thought. The judge was a methodical man who believed in facts and evidence. The encounter with Joseph Crowfeather had triggered his suspicions, but he needed more than suspicion to act. Over the next several days, he began making discreet inquiries about his daughter's recent activities. What he discovered alarmed him greatly. Margaret had indeed been visiting the library frequently, but the librarian mentioned that she often left shortly after arriving. Her charity work, which she claimed took up much of her time, seemed to involve fewer hours than she had needed. Most troubling of all, Miss Anderson, who lived near the Nididio settlement outside the city, mentioned seeing a young lady who looked remarkably like Margaret walking in that area. On several occasions, Judge Thornton was a man who valued his reputation above almost everything else. The possibility that his daughter might be involved in some kind of inappropriate relationship with an indigenous man was not just personally devastating, it was professionally dangerous. It was professionally dangerous. In 1960, Ottawa, such a scandal could destroy his career and social standing. On a cold Thursday evening in late February, Judge Thornton confronted his daughter directly. "Margaret," he said as he prepared to leave for what she claimed was a charity meeting, "I need to speak with you." Something in his tone made Margaret's blood run cold. "Of course, father. Sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk in the study. "I have some questions for you, and I expect honest answers." Margaret sat, trying to keep her expression neutral despite the fear that was building in her chest. "I've been making some inquiries about your recent activities," Judge Thornton began. "It seems that your charity work and library visits don't account for all the time you've been spending away from home." Margaret's mouth went wry. "I don't understand what you're suggesting, father." "I'm not suggesting anything," the judge replied coldly. "I'm stating facts. You have been seen in areas of the city where you have no legitimate business. You have been observed near the indigenous settlement on multiple occasions, and I have reason to believe that you have been meeting secretly with someone." The weight of discovery settled over Margaret like a heavy blanket. She could deny it, but her father was too intelligent and too experienced at detecting lies to be fooled by denials. "Father," she began carefully, "I can explain." "Can you?" Judge Thornton interrupted. "Can you explain why my daughter, a young lady of good family and excellent prospects, has been conducting secret meetings with an Indian man?" The blunt statement hung in the air between them. Margaret realized that her father already knew the truth, or at least enough of it to destroy her. "How long has this been going on?" Judge Thornton demanded. Margaret lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. "Since October, when I helped Mr. Crow Feather get medical care for his sick daughter. His daughter? Judge Thornton's expression grew even more stern. You've been involved with a man who has a child? Sarah is a wonderful little girl, Margaret said defensively. She was very ill, and I helped care for her. That's how Joseph and I became pals. Close, Judge Thornton repeated, his voice dripping with disapproval. Exactly how close, Margaret? Margaret met her father's gaze directly. I love him, father, and he loves me. The confession hit Judge Thornton like a physical blow. He had suspected an inappropriate friendship, perhaps even a foolish infatuation. But the idea that his daughter was actually in love with an indigenous man was beyond his worst fears. Love, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. You think you love this man? You know I love him, Margaret replied firmly. He's intelligent, kind, honorable, and devoted to his daughter. He treats me with more respect and consideration than any man I've ever met. Judge Thornton stood up abruptly, beginning to pace behind his desk. Margaret, do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand the scandal this could create? The damage to our family's reputation? I understand that you're more concerned with reputation than with my happiness, Margaret shot back, her own anger beginning to rise. Your happiness? Judge Thornton turned on her. What happiness could you possibly have with such a man? Where would you live? How would you support yourselves? What kind of life could you have? A life based on love and mutual respect, Margaret replied. Something I'm likely to find in the kind of marriage you want to arrange for me. Judge Thornton stopped pacing and fixed his daughter with a stare that had intimidated countless defendants in his courtroom. This ends now, Margaret. You will have no further contact with this man. You will accept Thomas Whitmore's courtship, and you will marry him as soon as arrangements can be made. I will not, Margaret said, standing to face her father. You cannot force me to marry someone I don't love. Can't I? Judge Thornton's voice was cold as winter wind. You are my daughter, living in my house, dependent on my support. You will do as I say, or you will face the consequences. What consequences? Margaret challenged. You will be cut off from this family completely, Judge Thornton said. No money, no support, no home. You will be completely on your own, and I will make sure that this Indian lover of yours loses his government position. I have considerable influence with the Indian Affairs Office. The threat to Joseph hit Margaret harder than any threat to herself. She knew her father had the power to destroy Joseph's career, and without his government work, Joseph would have no way to support himself and Sarah. You would destroy an innocent man's livelihood out of spite. Margaret asked. He would protect my family's honor by any means necessary, Judge Thornton replied. The choice is yours, Margaret. End this relationship and marry Thomas Whitmore, or face the consequences of your actions. Margaret stared at her father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in her life. The man she had respected and admired was willing to destroy the happiness of everyone involved to protect his own social standing. I need time to think, she said finally. You have until tomorrow evening, Judge Thornton said. Then I expect your answer. The tension is building to an incredible climax. If you're as invested in this story as we are, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the dramatic conclusion. What do you think? Margaret will choose love or family duty? Margaret spent that night staring out her bedroom window at the snow-covered streets of Ottawa, her mind racing through impossible scenarios and devastating choices. Every option seemed to lead to heartbreak for someone she loved. If she obeyed her father and ended her relationship with Joseph, she would be condemning herself to a loveless marriage with Thomas Whitmore, a perfectly respectable man whom she could never love the way she loved Joseph. But if she defied her father, Joseph would lose his livelihood, and she would be cut off from her family and financial support with no clear way to survive. The cruelest aspect of her situation was that her father's threats weren't empty. Judge Thornton had the influence and determination to carry them out. Joseph's position with the government was precarious at best. Indigenous employees were always the first to be dismissed when political winds shifted, and any hint of scandal would provide the perfect excuse. As dawn broke over the city, Margaret made a decision that broke her heart, but seemed to be the only way to protect the man she loved. She would have to end their relationship, but she would do it in a way that might give them both a chance at a different kind of future. That morning, she sent a message to Joseph through their usual intermediary, a sympathetic young clerk at the library who had unknowingly been helping them coordinate their meetings. The message was brief. "Meet me at our place by the river. Urgent." Joseph arrived at their meeting spot with a sense of foreboding. Something in Margaret's message had alarmed him, and when he saw her face, his worst fears were confirmed. "My father knows," Margaret said without preamble. "He knows about us, about our meetings, about everything." Joseph closed his eyes, feeling the weight of discovery settle over him like a stone. "How much does he know?" "Everything that matters," Margaret replied. "He's given me an ultimatum. I must end our relationship and marry Thomas Whitmore, or he'll cut me off completely and use his influence to have you dismissed from your government position." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the frozen river. "I see," he said finally. "And what have you decided?" Margaret's voice broke as she answered. "I can't let him destroy your career, Joseph. You need that job to support Sarah. Without it, you'd have no way to provide for her. So you're choosing to sacrifice your happiness for mine," Joseph said quietly. "I'm choosing to protect the people I love," Margaret corrected. "You and Sarah mean more to me than my own happiness." Joseph turned to face her, his dark eyes filled with pain. "Margaret, I can't let you do this. I can't let you throw away your life for me." "It's not your choice to make," Margaret said firmly. "It's mine, and I've made it." They stood in silence for several minutes, both struggling with the magnitude of what was happening. Finally, Joseph spoke. "There might be another way," he said slowly. Margaret looked at him with hope. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about this all night," Joseph said. "What if we left? Not just Ottawa, but Canada entirely. I have some contacts in the United States, other indigenous people who have found ways to build new lives there. We could go west, to the territories where the old rules don't apply. As strictly. Margaret felt her heart leap at the possibility, but then reality set in. "Joseph, we have no money for such a journey." "And what about Sarah? Could we really ask her to leave everything she knows?" "Sarah is young," Joseph said. "She would adapt. As for money," he hesitated, then continued. "You mentioned your grandmother's inheritance. I don't gain control of it until I'm 25. Margaret reminded him. "That's still 2 years away." "Then we wait," Joseph said with sudden determination. "We end this relation empirically as your father demands. You marry Thomas Whitmore if you must. But in 2 years, when you gain control of your inheritance, we find a way to be together." Margaret stared at him in shock. "You're asking me to marry another man and wait 2 years for you?" "I'm asking you to survive," Joseph said. "To find a way for both of us to survive, until we can build the life we want together." The plan was audacious, heartbreaking, and possibly impossible. But it was also the only option that didn't require someone to sacrifice everything. What if Thomas wants to? What if he expects a real marriage? Margaret asked, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Joseph's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to consider the practical realities. "Then you'll have to find ways to delay, to avoid intimacy. It won't be easy, but it might be possible if you're clever about it." "And what about you?" Margaret asked. "What will you do for 2 years?" "I'll work, save money, and make preparations," Joseph said. "I'll research places where we could go, establish contacts, and create a plan for our escape." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. "It's so much to ask. So much could go wrong." Joseph took her hands in his. "Margaret, I love you enough to wait. I love you enough to endure 2 years of separation if it means we can have a lifetime together afterward. The question is whether you love me enough to do the same." Margaret looked into his eyes and saw the same determination that had first attracted her to him. "I don't love you that much," she whispered. "But how will we communicate? How will I know you're safe, that you haven't changed your mind?" Joseph thought for a moment. "Sarah," he said finally, "she adores you, and no one would think it strange if you occasionally sent her small gifts or letters. We can communicate through her." It was a fragile plan, dependent on countless variables and requiring enormous sacrifices from both of them. But it was also their only hope. "If we do this," Margaret said slowly, "we have to commit completely. No contact except Suryara, no meetings, no indication that we're anything more than strangers who once helped each other." "I understand," Joseph said, "and if something goes wrong, if the plan becomes impossible," Margaret's voice trailed off. "Then we'll find another way," Joseph said firmly. "Margaret, I'm not giving up on us. Not now, not ever." They spent the rest of their meeting working out the details of their desperate plan. Margaret would return home and tell her father that she had ended the relationship. She would accept Thomas Whitmore's courtship, and if necessary marry him. Joseph would continue his work and begin making preparations for their eventual escape. As they prepared to part, both knowing it might be years before they could hold each other again, Joseph pulled Margaret into his arms. 2 years, he whispered against her hair. 2 years, and then we'll be free. 2 years, Margaret agreed, memorizing the feeling of being in his arms. Their final kiss was desperate and tender, filled with all the love they couldn't express and all the hope they were clinging to. When they finally separated, both had tears in their eyes. "I love you," Margaret said. "I love you too," Joseph replied. Always. They walked away in opposite directions, both carrying the weight of an impossible promise and the fragile hope that love might somehow find a way. That evening, Margaret faced her father in his study once again. "I've made my decision," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "I will end my relationship with Mr. Crowfeather and accept Mr. Whitmore's courtship." Dax Thornton studied the starter's face, looking for any sign of deception. "You understand that this decision is final? There can be no going back." "I understand," Margaret said. "Very well," Dax Thornton said. "I'll contact Thomas Whitmore in the morning. I'm sure he'll be delighted to hear of your change of heart." Margaret nodded and turned to leave, but her father's voice stopped her. "Margaret," he said, his tone slightly softer, "I know this seems harsh, but someday you'll understand that I'm doing this for your own good. A marriage based on practical considerations and mutual respect can grow into love. What you thought you felt for that Indian was just infatuation." Margaret looked back at her father, seeing him clearly for what he was. A man so trapped by social conventions that he couldn't recognize true love when it stood before him. "Yes, father," she said quietly, "I'm sure you're right." But in her heart, Margaret knew that what she felt for Joseph was anything but infatuation. It was the kind of love that could endure separation, sacrifice, and even the passage of years. The question was whether it would be strong enough to survive the test they were about to face. 2 years later, Mark Andrews Presbyterian Church, with Judge Thornton proudly walking his daughter down the aisle to marry one of the city's most promising young lawyers. To all observers, it appeared to be a perfect match between two prominent families. What the wedding guests didn't know was that the bride's heart belonged to another man entirely, and that she was counting down the days until she could claim her inheritance and disappear forever. Margaret played her role perfectly for nearly 2 years. She had been a dutiful wife to Thomas, managing their household with efficiency and grace, attending social functions with appropriate enthusiasm, and maintaining the facade of a contented married woman. Thomas, for his part, had been patient with what he assumed was his wife's natural shyness about physical intimacy, accepting her explanations about wanting to wait before starting a family. But now, as Margaret's 25th birthday approached, the careful structure of lies and delays was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Thomas was beginning to ask more pointed questions about their future plans, and Margaret knew that she was running out of time and excuses. The communication system she and Joseph had established through Sarah had worked better than either had dared hope. Margaret regularly sent the little girl books, small gifts, and letters that contained coded messages for Joseph. In return, Sarah's thank you notes, obviously dictated by her father, contained updates on Joseph's preparations for their escape. Through these carefully crafted messages, Margaret learned that Joseph had been saving every penny he could, had established contact with indigenous communities in the American territories, and had even found a potential guide who could help them travel safely to their destination. Most importantly, his love for her had not wavered despite the long separation. On a cold March morning, exactly 1 week before her 25th birthday, Margaret received a message that made her heart race. Hidden within Sarah's latest thank you note was a single sentence that changed everything. Papa says the spring flowers will bloom early this year. It was the signal they had agreed upon. Joseph was ready, and it was time to act. That evening, Margaret sat in her elegant parlour, ostensibly reading, while Thomas worked on legal briefs at his desk. She studied her husband's profile, feeling a mixture of guilt and pity for the deception she was about to perpetrate. Thomas was a good man, kind, intelligent, and devoted to her in his own way. He deserved better than a wife whose heart belonged to another. Thomas, she said carefully, I've been thinking about taking a trip to visit my cousin in Montreal. She's been asking me to come for months, and I thought perhaps after my birthday. Thomas looked up from his papers with interest. That sounds like an excellent idea. The change of scenery would do you good. How long were you thinking of staying? Margaret's heart pounded as she delivered the lie that would set their plan in motion. Perhaps a month or two. Cousin Elizabeth has been quite lonely since her husband's death, and I think she could use the company. Of course, Thomas agreed readily. I'll arrange for your travel, and perhaps I can join you for a few days if my schedule permits. That's very thoughtful, Margaret said, hating herself for the deception. But I think Elizabeth needs some time with just family. Perhaps another time. Thomas nodded, already turning back to his work. Whatever you think best, my dear. 1 week later, on her 25th birthday, Margaret went to the bank and formally claimed control of her grandmother's inheritance. The amount was substantial, enough to fund a new life far from Ottawa, if managed carefully. That afternoon, she sent a final coded message to Joseph through Sarah. The spring flowers are ready to be picked. 3 days later, Margaret boarded a train bound for Montreal, carrying 2 suitcases and wearing the traveling dress of a respectable married woman. What no one knew was that she had no intention of reaching Montreal. At the first major stop, she would disembark, change into the simple clothes hidden in her luggage, and begin the most dangerous journey of her life. The plan they had devised was audacious in its simplicity. Margaret would disappear during her supposed trip to Montreal, while Joseph would resign from his government position, claiming a desire to return to traditional indigenous life. They would meet at a predetermined location near the American border, then travel together to the Dakota Territory, where Joseph had contacts among the Lakota people who might accept him. It was a plan that required them to abandon everything they had known and loved, except for each other and Sarah. If they were caught, Margaret would face social ruin and possible legal consequences for abandoning her marriage, while Joseph could face charges of kidnapping or worse. But as Margaret sat on the train, watching the familiar landscape of the Ottawa Valley roll past her window, she felt no regret. After 2 years of living a lie, she was finally taking control of her own destiny. The meeting with Joseph took place exactly as planned, at a small inn near the border, where they had arranged to rendezvous. When Margaret saw him waiting for her, along with Sarah, who had grown taller and more beautiful in the 2 years since they had been forced apart, she felt as if her heart might burst with joy. Margaret, Joseph said simply, and the way he spoke her name contained all the love and longing. Margaret, Joseph said simply, and the way he spoke her name contained all the love and longing of their 2-year separation. "Papa," Sarah cried, running to embrace Margaret, "I missed you so much." Margaret knelt to hug the little girl, tears streaming down her face. "I missed you too, sweetheart, more than you could ever know." When she stood, Joseph was there, his eyes drinking in the sight of her, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. For a moment they simply stood looking at each other, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had accomplished and what lay ahead. "Are you ready for this?" Joseph asked quietly. "Once we cross that border, there's no going back." Margaret took his hand, feeling the same rightness he had felt during their first kiss 2 years earlier. "I've been ready since the day we said goodbye." Their journey to the Dakota Territory was arduous and dangerous, but it was also filled with a joy that neither had experienced in years. They traveled as a family, Joseph and Margaret as husband and wife, with Sarah as their daughter. To anyone who met them, they appeared to be a mixed-race family heading west to start a new life, which was not uncommon in the frontier territory. What made their story remarkable was not just their successful escape, but what they built together in their new life. Joseph's skills as a translator and Margaret's education made them valuable members of their new community. They established a small trading post that served both indigenous and white settlers, becoming known for their fairness and honesty in business dealings. Margaret, now calling herself Mary Crow Feather, used her inheritance wisely, investing in land and livestock that provided security for their family. She also used her education to establish a small school that served children from both indigenous and settler families, something almost unheard of in that time and place. Joseph and Margaret had 3 more children together, and Sarah grew up to become a teacher herself, carrying on her stepmother's work of bridging cultural divides through education. The family became respected members of their community, known for their integrity and their commitment to helping others, regardless of their background. But the most remarkable aspect of their story remained Sarah Mitchell, a historian researching mid-20th century immigration patterns in the Dakota Territory, was going through a collection of documents donated to the University of North Dakota by the descendants of early settlers. Among the papers was a leather-bound journal that had belonged to a woman named Mary Crow Feather. Dr. Mitchell initially assumed it would be a typical frontier woman's diary, but as she began reading, she realized she had discovered something extraordinary. The journal, written in an educated hand, told the story of Margaret Thornton's transformation into Mary Crow Feather, complete with details about her life in Ottawa society, her love affair with Joseph, and their elaborate escape plan. But the real shock came when Mitchell cross-referenced the names and dates in the journal with official records from Ottawa. Margaret Thornton had indeed existed, and she had indeed married Thomas Whitmore Jr. But according to official records, she had died in a train accident while traveling to Montreal in March. A search of the train wreckage from a derailment that occurred during her supposed journey had turned up personal effects that were identified as belonging to Margaret. Thomas had grieved his wife's death for the rest of his life, never remarrying and establishing a charitable foundation in her memory. The truth was that Margaret had planted her personal effects on the train, knowing about the dangerous stretch of track where accidents were common. When the derailment occurred exactly as she had hoped, her death provided the perfect cover for her disappearance. Dr. Mitchell's discovery sent shockwaves through the historical community. Here was documented proof of an interracial love story that had succeeded against impossible odds, involving elaborate deception, fake death, and the creation of entirely new identities. But the story had one more surprise in store. Among the documents Mitchell found was a letter written by Margaret in 1895, 22 years after her death. The letter was addressed to Thomas Whitmore Jr., though it was never sent. In the letter, Margaret expressed her deep regret for the pain she had caused him and explained her reasons for the deception. She wrote about the impossible choice she had faced between duty and love, and how she had chosen love despite the cost. Most remarkably, she revealed that she had followed Thomas's life from afar and knew about the charitable foundation he had established in her memory. The letter concluded with a revelation that stunned Dr. Mitchell. Margaret secretly funded Thomas's charitable foundation through anonymous donations, using the profits from her trading post to support the very memorial created for her supposed death. "I know I can never undo the pain I caused you," Margaret had written, "but perhaps I can honor your goodness by supporting the work you do in memory of the woman you thought I was. You deserved a better wife than I could ever have been, but you were a better husband than I deserved." The letter was signed Margaret Thornton Crowfeather, acknowledging both the woman she had been and the woman she had become. This incredible true story shows us that love really can conquer all obstacles. If you found this historical discovery as fascinating as we did, please share your thoughts in the comments below about what you think of Margaret and Joseph's incredible journey. Don't forget to check the description for more information about where you can find additional historical resources and our location for more amazing stories like this one. Dr. Mitchell's discovery led to a complete reevaluation of the historical record. Margaret and Joseph's story became the subject of academic papers, documentary films, and historical novels. Their trading post site was excavated and turned into a historical landmark, and their school was recognized as one of the earliest examples of integrated education in the American West. But perhaps the most important legacy of their story was what it revealed about the power of love to transcend social barriers and the courage required to choose personal happiness over social expectations. Margaret Thornton and Joseph Crowfeather had risked everything for love and had succeeded in building a life together that honored both their backgrounds while creating something entirely new. Their story challenged assumptions about interracial relationships in the 19th century and provided evidence that love stories like theirs were not just possible but had actually occurred. The secret that shocked historians was not just that such a love story had existed, but that it had succeeded so completely that it had remained hidden for over a century. Margaret and Joseph had not just escaped their circumstances, they had transformed them, creating a legacy of love, education, and community service that outlasted their own lives. Their story serves as a reminder that history is full of untold stories of courage, love, and determination. Behind the official records and public narratives lay countless individual stories of people who chose to follow their hearts, despite the obstacles they faced. Margaret and Joseph's love story began with a chance encounter outside a church in Ottawa, and ended with the creation of a family and community that bridged two worlds. It was a love story that required them to die to their old selves and be reborn as new people. But it was also a love story that proved that sometimes, against all odds, love really can conquer all. The journal that revealed their secret concluded with Margaret's final entry, written shortly before her actual death, in Mintos, the age of 76. "I have lived two lives, one as Margaret Thornton, bound by duty and expectation, and one as Mary Crowfeather, free to love and be loved as I chose. I regret the pain my choices cost others, but I cannot regret the choices themselves. Love is the only thing that makes life worth living, and I have been blessed to know true love for 50 years. If I had to choose again, knowing all the costs and consequences, I would choose love every time." Joseph had died 2 years earlier, and Margaret followed him within months, as if she could not bear to be separated from him again. They were buried side by side in the small cemetery near their trading post, their graves marked with a simple stone that read Joseph and Mary Crowfeather, united in love, united in death. Their story, hidden for over a century, finally came to light as a testament to the power of love to overcome any obstacle and the courage required to choose happiness over convention. It remains one of the most remarkable love stories in North American history, proving that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simple decision to follow your heart. This incredible true story reminds us that love has always found a way to transcend boundaries, even in the most restrictive societies. Margaret and Joseph's courage to choose love over convention, and their success in building a life together despite overwhelming obstacles, continues to inspire people more than Their story proves that the most powerful force in human history has always been the simple decision to love without limits.